Welcome to this interesting program we're going to have this evening. You can just see from the picture that the program invites our curiosity to learn more. Mill Street is Yesler, but you're gonna talk about that, so I won't steal her thunder. We are blessed with this wonderful program tonight. It fits into a series of programs that we're doing that relate to Beacon Hill, though Megan's going to talk about more than things that take place in more than Beacon Hill. But as we learned from Ron Chu last week, many people from international backgrounds came to this area and settled up on Beacon Hill. So we're going to get some background about that. I want to remind you that on May 15th, we're taking a field trip to central Beacon Hill. We're going to visit the garden house, which was an original property on Beacon Hill that's now been purchased by the Historic Seattle Group. And it's a lovely site, and the director of Historic Seattle will greet us there, somebody that works for them, and tell us about the house. And then we're going to walk to El Centro de la Raza from there and see some of the activities that are happening in that building. We're also going to have a speaker who's going to give us a history of Beacon Hill, and that hasn't been locked in yet, but we're moving in that direction. And then on June 8th, we're going to have a walk in central Beacon Hill. We're going to Jefferson Park and see the Beacon Food Forest. So look for those things in a bulletin. I think it's going to be nice that we get back to being immersed in a neighborhood and really learn about that neighborhood. And we're very excited for our speaker tonight. Some of us have had the opportunity to hear her talk already, and we know we'll learn more tonight. And I'm going to introduce Susan Underwood, who has been the person who's done the work in organizing this program.
Well, after a year of working to coordinate schedules, I really am excited to have Megan here. And it's just a privilege, so thank you. A short introduction. Megan is an award-winning scholar, writer, and teacher of Asian history, urban history, and public humanities. Her work spans academic scholarship and public history. She was born and raised in Seattle and currently works as an associate professor of history at the University of California, Riverside. Tonight she's speaking about her book, Seattle from the Margins, Exclusion, Erasure, and the Making of a Pacific Coast City. It reorients the early history of Seattle through the lens of those displaced and erased, but essential in the making of the city. As a modern metropolis, she reveals the histories of people who left few records of their own by expanding the written and oral history to include the geography and the built environment. The bibliography is really fun to read. It includes Seattle Building Department construction files, fire department logs of inspection and code violations, the Seattle Housing Authority's Department of Design, Construction, and Land Use, police files, old hotel ledgers, and Sanborn insurance maps, which are wonderfully colorful things to look at. It's an illuminating history of the neighborhood below the line where Seattle began and how it shaped the neighborhoods that followed. And after Megan speaks, we'll have a Q&A, and her book will be for sale over here at the end of the evening if you have a checkbook with you, and if not, we can make arrangements for you to pay tomorrow. So, Megan?
Is this on? Okay. Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thank you so much for coming today and taking your time to hear my talk about Seattle history. I want to thank Susan for inviting me. and going back and forth and figuring out the logistics of inviting me here. And thank you also to the folks who had dinner with me tonight and the great conversation that we had. Okay, so many years ago, I came across a memoir written by a Japanese American man named Frank Kubo. I was working at the time at Densho. It's a local Seattle-based organization that is dedicated to preserving and sharing stories of Japanese American history, and specifically the World War II incarceration of Japanese Americans. And we collected oral histories, photographs, and other documents that revealed and illuminated that history. So I was working there, and I was working really collecting, photographs and records from people, right? Everyday people from the community who were cleaning out their garages and their closets and would find boxes of stuff, and they would bring them in, and we would actually digitize it. And then we had an archive online where we would show the all of the records to whoever wanted to view them. So I was doing that work at the time. This was the early 2000s. And this woman came into our office. Her name was Fran, and she had a big box full of her father's papers. It was just one of these big banker boxes filled to the brim with, old photographs and photo albums. And so I sat with her for several days, and we were kind of organizing the collection, and I was doing an inventory of it. And I found a really interesting, here is actually one of the photographs that, Fran brought in of her father. And this is her father, Frank, and his siblings in Algona, which was a kind of a farming town near Auburn, Washington, taken in the 19-teens. Frank is on the left. And I love this photograph. I love the old bicycle that he has here, the metal bicycle. So I was going through a lot of photographs like this, which were truly incredible, but I found something that was very interesting and kind of piqued my curiosity. And that was a memoir that her father, Frank, had written right before he had passed. And this was kind of a short typewritten document that kind of recounted his life as a Japanese person coming to the United States. And in fact, he was born in Auburn, Washington, and Algona to two Japanese immigrant parents who worked as tenant farmers, right? So they didn't own the land. They kind of they leased the land and worked the land. They had 3 children, including Frank. And then they just couldn't quite keep up their farm, and they lost it, and they decided to return to Japan with Frank and his siblings. Here they are. So Frank was born in the United States, but he actually grew up in Japan during the early 20th century, which was very common. My grandmother had the same story, right? She was a United States citizen, but then was sent back to Japan to spend her childhood. But then when Frank became, a teenager, he was 16, 17, he wanted to return to the United States to get an education and pursue more opportunities. So he convinced his father, apparently, to allow him to come to the United States in 1927. So he bought a one-way ticket from Yokohama to Seattle. And that journey at the time took 3 weeks, right? It was on a steamship. Crossed the Pacific and arrived in Seattle in 1927. So all of this is explained in his memoir, which is shown here on the screen, an excerpt of it. So Frank had an uncle who greeted him right at the docks in Seattle and brought him to a place called the New Home Hotel, which was located right along the waterfront. And this is what Frank said, I'm quoting him here. Since it was already summer, all the schools were closed. My uncle took me to the Nishimura Employment Office to apply for an Alaska salmon cannery job. So job up in the canneries up in Alaska. So Frank stored his belongings that day at the hotel, and then he took a boat up to St. Petersburg, Alaska, filled with, quote, Japanese men of all ages. He worked 1 season at the cannery and then returned to Seattle with $120 in cash, which he sent home to his family in Japan. So he was kind of wondering what to do next, and then he decided to spend the winter at the New Home Hotel. Again, was very common for people to live in a hotel like this, and his uncle was managing it. Come spring, Frank found another job peddling food and supplies to Japanese workers around the region. That summer, it was back to Alaska for salmon canning season. He returned to Seattle for winter, and he kind of continued the cycle year after year. So when I read Frank's account of his life in the Pacific Northwest, I was very intrigued because it seemed like he was really opening up a world into what it was like to be a migratory laborer, a migrant worker, someone who moved around a lot seasonally. And this is something that looked very different from what I was used to learning about Japanese American history. And many of my interview subjects at Densho, when I was interviewing them, told very particular stories. And these accounts often describe people who would come to the United States, they would put down roots, they would create stable communities in institutions through slow, hard-earned growth. But what Frank was describing was very different. It was really this life of continual movement around the region. He wasn't kind of staying in one place. It was a life of continual movement, in some ways of disruption and uprootedness. And so he was experiencing Seattle not necessarily as a kind of melting pot where people were welcomed and everyone was able to kind of settle down, but rather a kind of exclusionary city, one that was built to include certain people and exclude others, and also to facilitate the movement of a particular kind of worker around the region. So that was very interesting to me. So I wondered after reading this, how common was his experience? Was this just a kind of unique experience to him, or did it speak to a broader shared experience among Seattle's workers, right? Among Seattle's poor and working class residents at the time? And if it did illuminate a broader historical pattern or experience, I was curious as to why I had never really heard of this before. And I was at that time, I really considered myself to be pretty informed about Seattle history. I had written a thesis in college about Seattle history, and I had worked in public history and archives for several years in Seattle, but I hadn't quite encountered a story like this. And so this motivated me to kind of tell a different kind of Seattle history and to pursue research and eventually writing, which became a book. A different kind of Seattle history, one that centered the voices and experiences of workers like Frank, workers who were moving around a lot, workers who were really pushed to the margins of urban society. And this culminated in my book, Seattle from the Margins, which is displayed right here. Exclusion, Erasure, and the Making of a Pacific Coast City. So what I learned through the research process, which did take quite some time, it took, say, over 10 years to do this research, is that Frank's story really was not unusual. It was very typical of a particular kind of migrant. And so Frank's story, in fact, was very common in the Pacific Northwest for many kinds of workers, especially Asian workers, indigenous workers, and European immigrant workers in the Pacific Northwest from the mid-19th century through the first years of World War II. And this really had to do with the economy of the Northwest. So if you know about the history of this region, the early history revolved around a lot of natural resource extraction and agriculture. So logging and coal, lumber processing, coal mining, fishing, the canneries, hop picking, berry farming. The kind of work that required highly mobile workers and kind of a seasonal labor force. Workers who were desired by employers for their mobility as much as for their labor, right? So this wasn't a workforce that was staying in place. They were moving around a lot. And so Seattle's urban development during this early period was linked to this regional economy of the Northwest. So one of the things I talk about in my book is that Seattle's history during these early years is really linked to the broader region of the Northwest. Seattle played a central role in the kind of economy of resource extraction. So the city was a hub of labor migration, kind of stopping over place for workers and others passing in and out of the city, to and from the labor camps and the lumber towns that were kind of dotting the region's hinterlands. So they would come, they would pass through Seattle, or they would stay in Seattle for a few days, for a few weeks, a few months, and then they would go on their way, pursuing work around the region. And so when Frank arrived in 1927, he was joining a migratory labor stream that was really as old as the city itself and had helped to establish Seattle as a city and as a major metropolis of the Northwest. So one question is kind of, how did this come to be? Why Seattle? Why Seattle of all cities? Did the city emerge with this particular role as a hub of labor migration and kind of center of employment in the Northwest? Well, I would say in general, cities during this period in the United States and really in North America had high transient populations. That was just kind of the nature of cities during this period. And yet Seattle was by far one of the most transient cities, meaning that it had the highest transient population among all cities in the United States. And I found a study done in 1920 that found that Seattle had, again, one of the highest transient populations in the entire country. Again, this is 1920. And the sociologists who did this study measured this by the number of hotel rooms that Seattle had per capita. So what we're seeing in Seattle is a kind of heightened dynamic that was happening all over the place, but in a kind of intensified way in the city itself because of, I think, the nature of the economy and the city's role within it. Again, it was acting as a kind of nexus or a hub in the movement of people and goods. So Seattle really was shaped to a very high degree by migrant labor and the particular dynamics of transiency more than really, I would say, most other cities in North America. So a key factor in kind of enabling this circulation of people and what made Seattle unique, I would argue, is its maritime environment. So Seattle's connection to the Pacific world, to the Salish Sea, to the Puget Sound, and to the many rivers of this Cascade Mountain range allowed for the movement of people and goods before the arrival of the railroad, okay? So I think, very often scholars who work on this kind of time period often focus on the transcontinental railroad, right? The railroad being the key factor that sort of explains urbanization and explains the rise of cities, especially in the West. And yet, I think in Seattle's case, this doesn't make a lot of sense because here, water played a far more important role in the formation of the economy and in laying the foundation of the city's urban roots. Seattle did not have a direct connection to a transcontinental railroad line until the 1890s. And even then, water-based transportation remained much more widespread. And I argue in the book, this is something that helps explain why Seattle emerged as a central hub of migration and why it kind of played this role in the economy as it did. So I have here a map that you'll see, and this is a map that was made by a tremendous cartographer named Ben Pease. It's in my book, actually, and I think it shows really well this kind of maritime geography that I'm referencing here. So this is the map of the Salish Sea, which includes the Strait of Georgia, the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and the Puget Sound, right? All of them are labeled, if you can see. And then all of them kind of flow into the Pacific Ocean. So Seattle is a city that has a connection to the Pacific Ocean directly. But also, as you can see, Seattle is in a kind of central location along the Puget Sound. And it also has a lot of proximity to different rivers, right? So if you look on the right side of the map, you'll see all the different rivers, right, that flow from the Cascade Mountain Range. So the Puyallup River, the White River, Duwamish, Cedar, et cetera. And so this kind of unique maritime environment allowed Seattle to kind of develop in a way that wasn't necessarily tied to the railroad. So again, Seattle's central position within the Salish Sea, within the Puget Sound, and at the convergence of many different bodies of water, including rivers, made it an ideal stopping over point for workers and others passing through the region. And again, this was happening before the arrival of the railroad and before there was any kind of land-based transportation. And so I think it's important to think about, when we move away from the story of the railroad, which is, again, so dominant in studies of Seattle history and studies of the American West. But actually, when we sort of move away from that narrative of the railroad, we begin to see kind of new histories. We begin to see new voices come to the forefront. And I think the railroad ultimately is centering a settler perspective. It's centering a settler perspective. But when we focus on water and maritime routes, we begin to see, for example, the crucial role of indigenous peoples in building the city and establishing Seattle as a hub of migration. So Coast Salish peoples had been using Seattle as a crossing over place really since time immemorial, right, for hundreds and hundreds of years. And in fact, the word for the lands that would become Seattle in Lushootseed, which is the language of Puget Sound indigenous peoples, was crossing over place, right? So it was a place for hundreds and hundreds of years where people would converge from all over the region in the summer months to meet with family, to socialize, to engage in fishing and other resource gathering. So often, as a Seattle historian, I'm very familiar with the Klondike Gold Rush, right? The 1890s. This is kind of often highlighted by scholars as the moment when Seattle became a major city, because everyone was converging during the gold rush in search of gold in the 1890s, right? It was kind of this stopping over point on the way up to Alaska. And yet what I found is that indigenous peoples had been using Seattle as this kind of stopping over place, crossing over place for hundreds of years before we even see miners coming up, right, for the gold rush in Seattle, right? So they were traversing routes that had been long carved out by Coast Salish and other indigenous peoples of the Puget Sound region and the larger Northwest coast. So I think, we when we kind of look at water instead of land, and we look at sort of waterways instead of the railroad, we can start to see, new perspectives. We can start to see an indigenous perspective. We can also start to see an Asian perspective, an Asian migrant perspective. Seattle, as I said, was very connected to the Pacific Ocean. And one of the things that some of the settlers were very interested in at the time was actually creating a direct linkage from Seattle to Asia and the Pacific world. Right? This was something that Henry Yesler, for example, was very invested in. And it was these Pacific connections that first brought Chinese people to Seattle in the early 1860s, where they joined indigenous peoples in the workforce. And these two groups really formed the core of Seattle's early urban workforce. So they were building the city. They were constructing buildings. They were digging roads. They were working in the sawmills. And then over time, we see Japanese workers and Filipino workers arriving as well and joining them. So I think this is an example of how shifting our frame of reference here, right? Again, moving from the railroad and the settler perspective to a maritime history, our entry point into Seattle history can begin to highlight different perspectives and different, I think, kinds of origin stories that we tell about our city, making visible different historical actors and different creators, right? People who are actually central in creating the city than we're used to seeing in many early Seattle histories, again, because I grew up in Seattle, so I'm familiar with a lot of the stories that are told about our city. And, we often hear so much about the settler perspective and about the kind of important people, the Yeslers and the Dennies, the miners who were going up to the Klondike. But I think, again, when we sort of reorient our perspective, we can make new voices visible. And this helps to make clear the convergence, I think, of Asian and indigenous histories in this region, which, again, we're so tied up in the maritime world of the Pacific Ocean and the Salish Sea. So we have a kind of economic system, in other words, in this early part of Seattle history that's really revolving around resource extraction and agriculture. Seattle is the kind of crossing over place, the hub of migration for Asian, Indigenous, and later other workers who are able to move around really easily from place to place and feed that demand for mobile itinerant labor. So within Seattle, the heart of this labor district was this small area I've kind of marked in red, this kind of red square that I've marked here. That was historically the convergence point for Indigenous peoples, most likely because of its central location along the sea. It also offered a protected space, I think, for fishing. And again, the name of this particular area in Lushootseed was the crossing over place. This shows a map of, if you can read it, of Yesler Way, which in the first slide, right, it said Mill Street. So Yesler Way, the previous name of Yesler Way was actually Mill Street. And you can see the Yesler and Company mill site right at the foot of Mill Street, or right at the foot of Yesler Way. So this is the area where Henry Yesler built his sawmill in 1853. And this was really the first business that was, built in Seattle. And this is also an area where the Duwamish, who were the first peoples of Seattle, the area that would become known as Seattle, were segregated into. So the Duwamish were Seattle's first workers. They staffed the mill. They cooked and cleaned for settlers, and they constructed the first buildings here. Settlers relied on Duwamish labor, and yet did not want to coexist with them, right? As they didn't want to coexist with them and to include them as part of Seattle society. So they created a bounded district around the sawmill, and again, that's this area I'm showing in red here on the map, which settlers called the Sawdust. And if you look on maps from the 1850s and sometimes even into the 1860s, you will see this area, the name of it, you will see the Sawdust marked on these maps. So the Sawdust was close enough, right, to this kind of northern area, which where most settlers lived. They called it the residence district. Close enough to provide the labor, but also separated from settlers who would move, again, who began to move north into the Bourens Tract, right, north of Yesler Way. So Yesler Way, again, formerly known as Mill Street, served as that original dividing line in Seattle. And if you know about Seattle, you'll know that it is very much divided into north and south, right? There's very much a north-south geography. That's true today. Certainly true when I was growing up, when my dad was growing up in the 50s. The origin of it is really here, right? The kind of northern area being the whiter and wealthier area of Seattle, the south being the poorer area and more multiracial and immigrant. Okay, so the origin of that is here. And I wanted to say that this happened very kind of overtly. How did this division happen? How was it kind of maintained? Well, it happened very overtly, as I found. So in 1865, shortly after Seattle was incorporated as a city formally, the new city government passed an ordinance concerning, quote unquote, the removal of Indians. And it read, "No Indian or Indians shall be permitted to reside or locate their residences on any street, highway, lane, alley, or any vacant lot in the town of Seattle," in the entire town. And it delineated a boundary around the northern district and kind of expelled them to the area near Yesler's Mill, so south of Yesler Way. So it was defining the city as kind of lacking an Indigenous presence, right? So this was very formal. And what it did also was expel the Indigenous peoples to this area kind of on the southern fringes, right, by the mill. And so interestingly, the ordinance was rescinded 3 years later. But to me, this does, I think, show the mindset of people of the time, right, who wanted to create a formal city, again, but without an Indigenous presence there. yet wanting to keep them close enough around to access their labor. And so this is also an area where Chinese migrants, when they started to arrive in the 1860s and larger numbers in the 1870s, were kind of confined into the same area. So they joined the Duwamish in being targeted by similar restrictions that sought to confine them to this area south of Yesler and to the sawdust, again, while also making them accessible as a workforce. So this is also an area that became a workers' hub, as well as a place of permanent residence for non-white Seattleites, including Asians, African Americans, and also for groups of people who were considered to be, quote unquote, I'm using quotes here, undesirable. So poor people, transient people, single women, people in interracial families, were all kind of pushed into this sort of south of the line, south of the divide sawdust area. And this happened as Seattle's economy expanded and more people arrived. They were all kind of pushed into this, again, this area called the sawdust over time. So confining the labor force into this one area also had a benefit for employers, for regional employers. It concentrated the workers into one small area of the city, making it very easy for them to access workers for that, again, that short-term season that they needed workers for. In other cities, what we do see is the workforce is much more spread out. But in Seattle, they're very concentrated, again, into this area, really, that I showed in the red square here. And again, this served, I think, both racial and economic functions, concentrated the workforce, and also concentrated all of the city's so-called undesirable people into one area. These were often both this kind of overlapping groups of people. So these few square blocks is actually what a lot of my book kind of focuses on, in the first few chapters at least. And it's quite fascinating from a historical perspective. If you think about the social history of this area here, of the sawdust, right, it's quite interesting. And it opens up a window into a different kind of Seattle history, one that's very diverse, one that's very heterogeneous. And it doesn't look like the Seattle history that I personally was taught as a kid. That was a very kind of settled history. It was a settler perspective, and also there wasn't a lot of diversity in terms of our historical narratives of the past. So this here shows us a very different window. It's very racially heterogeneous, and it's a district that's constantly changing based on what kinds of workers are available at different moments, who's passing through the city, right, in different seasons. It could even change from weekend to weekend or month to month. So just to show you what I mean, I wanted to walk you through some of the important sites of this district, in some ways to help you imagine what it might be like in the 1890s, kind of around the turn of the 20th century. So here's a great photo. This is a photo in my book from the UW Library's Special Collections. This is the waterfront. The foot of Washington Street. So Washington Street is 1 block south of Yesler. So if you go back, it's 1 block south here of Yesler Way or Mill Street. And it runs east-west, right, west-east. And here is the foot of Washington Street. And today, obviously, it looks very different, right? This was over 100 years ago. So today it looks very different. But if you could imagine putting yourself in the shoes of someone in 1890 to 1900, this is kind of what it would look like. So again, this was the waterfront, Washington Street. And this was a popular docking place for indigenous migrants and workers, again, as they continued their historical pattern of moving through the city and stopping over in Seattle. So you can actually see that this is a spectacle in some ways, because you can see the crowds that had assembled, right, on the top of the docks looking. You can also see that it's most likely summertime. It looks like the sun is out, people are, out and about. And this is presumably agricultural workers who are coming to work in the hops industry, which was huge in the Puget Sound region in the late 19th century. It was actually the region's first major agricultural industry. So hops, if you know, is the ingredient used for flavoring beer. Exactly. And it was very, very popular in the Northwest. There was a blight of the hop crops in the East Coast in New York, where they were historically grown. And so settlers kind of brought that industry west and established agriculture, hop growing in the Puget Sound region. And I think, well, I have a story about this in my book. I never thought I would know so much about hops, but eventually it moved over to Yakima, Washington. Actually, Yakima is still the place where the most hops are grown in the United States. But it was huge in Seattle, in and around Seattle, again in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s. And farmers employed a lot of indigenous workers to pick hops. And in fact, the farmers arranged their farms along the shores of major rivers, the Puyallup River, the White River, so that they could access this workforce by water. Remember, this is not a time when there's a lot of land-based transportation. It's much more convenient to move by water. And so indigenous workers came by canoe, traveling sometimes from great distances, even Alaska. It would include a stopping over in Seattle for a couple days on their way to the fields. And in the 1870s, I believe, okay, this is 1890s, but in the 1870s, it was not uncommon to see large fleets of canoes like this one docked in Seattle or moving around through the Sound. And indeed, farmers began to use Seattle as an employment and hiring center because of the large concentration of indigenous peoples there. So what they would do is they would travel up to Seattle to gather pickers. And often what we see is that different indigenous groups would appoint a labor representative to actually bargain with the employers and to kind of figure out things like payment. And then they would spend a few days in Seattle shopping, gathering supplies for the harvest season, and then head off for the 3 or 4 week picking season. And then they would return again to Seattle before they went back home. And hop picking started out as a local phenomenon. Growers were employing mostly Coast Salish peoples from around the Puget Sound, but then it kind of took on a life of its own. And people started coming, again, as I said, from up and down the Northwest coast as far north as Alaska. And in this way, Seattle took on an even more important role, again, as this kind of stopping over place. And employers started to look to larger and larger labor networks for hiring. And so Washington Street, again, if you think about the geography, was the area where a lot of this activity was happening. And so agricultural work was very appealing to many Coast Salish peoples, in part because it allowed them to travel by canoe with family members. So what we see here, it's kind of hard to tell in this photo, but there are families here. There are, mothers, fathers, children, grandparents, all traveling together and engage in this kind of seasonal migrations that had been, they're part of their cultural tradition and practice for hundreds of years. It allowed them to spend time with family, engage in resource gathering, earn a wage before returning home for winter. And hop picking allowed them to kind of weave their own agenda into the work itself. They often camped near the fields during harvest season, and this is a photograph of one of those camps, labor camps, and were able to engage in cultural practices, including using their own native languages, again, canoe travel with family, and engaging in certain practices that were deemed uncivilized, right, by missionaries, and were being suppressed in places like reservations in this moment. So it kind of gave them some independence and autonomy that they could not find at the time in the reservations and reserves in Canada. And so it's part of the reason why it became so popular. Often we see people coming first to work in the canneries, right? And then after that is done, traveling down the Puyallup or White River valleys for the harvest season. Okay, so moving on from the waterfront, if you think back to that, let me go back to that area that I'm talking about here, Washington Street, this kind of sawdust area. So if you move a few blocks east on Washington Street up from the water, we would come across, again, think this is 1890, we would come across a kind of 3-story brick building. And this was constructed again in 1890, just after the Seattle fire of 1889. And this was the headquarters building of the Quan Tuc Company, owned by a Chinese immigrant named Chin Gi-hee, who was one of the most prominent Chinese immigrants in Seattle and possibly even all of the Northwest during the late 19th century. So Chin Gi-hee was a founder of the Huachong Company, with one of his business partner, another Chinese resident of Seattle named Chun Ching Hock. Later, Chin Gi-hee split from his partner. They opened up separate businesses, and he focused on the labor contracting and employment services part of the business. So labor contracting was really what brought many Chinese immigrants to Seattle and the Pacific Northwest, starting a little bit in the 1860s, but really more intensely in the 1870s. Much of the Chinese labor and later Japanese labor was organized through this kind of system of labor contracting or employment services. A labor contractor was a middleman who worked with companies, including railroads, farms, and canneries, as well as cities, right, like Seattle, to supply workers, often in low-wage, physically dangerous jobs. The contractor was useful from the employer's perspective because it allowed them to outsource their labor needs. The contractor recruited and hired workers, oversaw their employment, housing, and food. And it was very kind of an exploitative system because many of the workers could not speak English, they were poor, and they really did not have a lot of rights in the US, especially in this time period. Contractors also kept their workers economically dependent through something called the credit ticket system, in which they would loan the workers their money, for passage to cover their journey from China or Hong Kong, and then they would take a portion of their paycheck when they reached the Pacific Northwest and they were working, which they had to pay back with a lot of interest. So this building here that's depicted on the slide is interesting because you can see the storefront is on the bottom floor and there's kind of like a couple other floors on top, and those top floors were to house the workers. So the contractor would recruit the workers, send them off to their jobs, house them at the site, and then when they returned, send them off again, right? When the call came from the railroad or the call came from the sawmill that they needed workers. And so it's interesting to me too, as someone who studies kind of Asian American history, this building was constructed in 1890. And so if you know anything about Asian American history, also in the Pacific Northwest, there was a spike in anti-Chinese violence in 1885, 1886, including in Seattle, where the city tried to expel all of the Chinese residents. They weren't successful. In Tacoma, actually, they were, right? They expelled all of the Chinese residents from Tacoma. They tried to do that in Seattle, but it wasn't successful. Some people came back. And so I think it's interesting. This is a sort of testament to the fact that the Chinese immigrant community was still here, right? It didn't disappear. It was still here. Certainly, they faced violence and they faced exclusion, but they did persist in the city. But immigration restriction in particular, and the violence that workers faced, really did have an impact on Chinese kind of employment agents and this kind of labor contracting business. So canneries still employed Chinese workers along with a handful of other industries. But as the government passed more restrictive immigration laws, restricting Chinese immigrants from coming into the United States, the labor kind of employment services sector for Chinese immigrants really it kind of collapsed. And in this vacuum, Japanese contractors and employment agents began to fill that void. So we see Japanese kind of employment agents and contractors kind of start to take over, right, those services until they were also faced with violence and immigration restriction. So, and here is an interesting photograph of Chinese hop pickers from 1883. And this is from Puyallup. The Washington State Historical Society has a lot of wonderful photographs from Washington State. was very difficult for me actually to find photographs of Chinese agricultural workers. This was the only one I was able to find. In fact, in 10 years of doing research, this was the only one. And I think in part it has to do with the fact that they were really kind of violently expelled from many of these industries and faced a lot of restrictions, but it's a kind of interesting thing. But you can see this is a Chinese agricultural encampment in Puyallup, 1883. So if we go from the waterfront, indigenous workers, we go up Washington Street to 2nd and 3rd Avenues, which was the center of Chinese employment, Chinese labor. If we actually would look across the street, so if you remember the building I just showed, Chingihi's building, across the street from that, in the early 20th century, was the headquarters of the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW. So they had a headquarter building right across from the Quantuck building, Chingihi's employment office. So the IWW, many of you probably have heard of the IWW, the Wobblies, right? That's how they were called, had a huge presence in the Pacific Northwest in the early 20th century. The IWW was a radical labor union that sought to unite workers across industries rather than organize them by trade, as was common in other unions such as the American Federation of Labor. It was notable in the fact that it was one of the few unions of the time to welcome all workers regardless of race. So many unions back in the day were very exclusionary along racial lines. They excluded especially Asian, but also often African American workers from their ranks. The IWW was an exception. And it also included unemployed workers, migrant workers, and others who had really been ignored from the other mainstream unions. So the IWW was appealing to many people, but particularly Europeans. So it had a huge following in the Northwest among Norwegians, Swedish immigrants, and Danish workers. They had very high participation in the IWW. Scandinavians were by far the largest foreign-born group in Seattle and the broader Pacific Northwest. Many of them, in fact, came to the Northwest through kind of these programs sponsored by the railroad companies to kind of bring white settlers to the areas where they build their railroad lines to make them profitable. Scandinavians were considered white and to be, quote unquote, the most desirable foreigners. And this is a quote directly from some of the records that I found with the Great Northern Railroad Company. However, many Scandinavians who came to the Northwest were too poor to buy land. And so many went to work in the lumber industry instead. Seattle served as the center of employment for the lumber industry, much like it did for agriculture. Lumber companies relied almost exclusively on employment agents who charged a fee for their services from job seekers. And so they incentivized kind of high turnover in the workforce. Foremen who oversaw the work often colluded with employment agents to make money, and so would hire and fire people constantly to make more money. So this cartoon here that's taken from the newspaper of the IWW, it's called The Industrial Worker. Actually, it was published in Seattle for several years, and there was a Swedish version of it in the Swedish language that was published as a kind of companion newspaper. So this cartoon is actually critiquing this cyclical hiring process, which produced high turnover. It was very exploitative for the workers. So it's called, it's kind of showing that kind of cycle and the corruption that was really rife in the industry at the time. I think that the IWW was very influential in the Northwest, in part because of the high proportion of workers who were in the lumber industry and were kind of fed up with the exploitation, and also the lack of direct response by other unions of the time. And as you can see here, I mean, this photograph makes it pretty clear, the conditions were truly terrible, right? Really poor. They lacked basic sanitation. They didn't have bedding or blankets, and often lived in very crowded, poorly ventilated bunkhouses, which is what you see in the woods. And so in some ways we can see that we can see why the IWW would kind of set up its headquarters right along Washington Street, again, which was the center of labor and employment across the Pacific Northwest, and it really drew many immigrants who lived and resided in this district. So one of my main goals with this book was to highlight a broader Seattle history that went beyond just one group or one community, and instead highlighted the interconnection among various groups of people in the workforce, and to really underscore that kind of heterogeneity and like diversity that we do see as an integral part of Seattle history. And so again, this district looked different at different moments of the day, different seasons, different years, as the workforce changed, as people moved in and out, and as immigration restriction changed the composition of the workforce over time. So just to conclude, I wanted to go back to the question that I asked at the beginning of the process of writing this book, which was, why didn't I know this history? And I think, what's at stake by not remembering this history? And I think this is a complicated question. My book tries to grapple with this question in different ways. But something that I found was that these communities were really deliberately targeted by the city in the 1930s, 1940s, even into the 1950s. They were labeled slums. They were deemed to be expendable, and many were demolished. So many of the sites that I discuss in the book, including a neighborhood actually not too far from here called Profanity Hill, right? It's a part of First Hill. It's the neighborhood that became Yesler Terrace, are gone today. And I would argue quite deliberately so. And with these demolitions, we do see that history is lost. And with that, the contributions of this earlier generation of workers, many of them also among the most vulnerable people in the city. And this has left us, I would argue, with a kind of warped view in a way of how the city came to be and the power dynamics that created this kind of vulnerable population in the first place. So I hope that my book in some small way contributes to a shift in how we remember the past, what we remember, and who we value in Seattle history. Thank you. I welcome your questions.
We'll start with questions on the right and move to the center and over to there, to the far left. And then we'll come back to the center, back here, back to the center, over there. So your turn will come. We'll just, so.
And I'm happy to speak about things that weren't directly about this presentation. If you had other questions, I'm happy to take those as well.
Did you want to? Oh, okay. There's a question here. We're going to rotate.
Do we have a question?
I don't
We
see
had a
anybody
question
over here.
Okay, then let's go to the center.
Oh, you'll have to turn it off.
It's not a question, it's the IWW. My dad hopped freights all the way from Michigan into the state of Washington and worked in labor camps. And he said, your description was nice. It was horrible. The food was not edible and the living conditions were terrible. And the IWW was very active. And when they tried to make demands on the owners of the lumber company and they were refused, he would see members of the IWW drive spikes into logs that were going to be milled. And then when we moved to Seattle in 1956, there was still an IWW office down on Yesler.
That is such an amazing story. Thank you. I want to talk to you after this and get some more information because, yes, I think the IWW, we can see why it was appealing to especially workers in the lumber industry because the level of exploitation was so intense and the conditions were so terrible. And the IWW also was very good at following the workers into the woods. They would kind of follow them. And it made their organizing actually very successful. And I should say, I talk about this in the book, But the IWW underwent intense repression, violence by the government, by lumber companies, by the police. They were jailed. Also, its leaders were deported. We see its leadership, which were many Scandinavian immigrants who hadn't naturalized as citizens at that point, were deported. And so that is actually one of the reasons why the IWW kind of fell apart. It had to do with the intense level of repression that they experienced. Yes, but thank you for bringing that up. That's an amazing story.
Question over here.
That's what you're here for. Show the picture of the Chinese workers in Puyallup, but your original pictures of them are in an office. I remember in sociology learning of middlemen minorities, and that often Chinese are mentioned in them, and that's a perfect picture, that they served as the middlemen between the natives and the white population. I know in Portland they also became the cooks in many prominent families. And I imagine they set up laundry shops all over the place too, and restaurants. Yeah, I have a feeling they were not really major agricultural workers. Occasionally they probably did, because there's always exceptions. Anyway, it's a thought.
Yes. So thank you. I think yes. So there's nuances in terms of class within different immigrant communities that I think isn't often talked about. We're kind of lumped together into a homogenous group. But yes, we see the middlemen. We're often like Chingy He here, pictured at in his office. So they often really worked hard. They kind of came from very little. They were able to cultivate relationships with prominent white elites in the cities. They often learned English, so they were bilingual. So this gave them, a way to kind of, converse with the elites, and also they spoke their native languages. But yes, I think the kind of entrepreneurs and the people who owned restaurants and small businesses also came from this kind of class of more elite, right, immigrants, who often, when the labor contracting businesses kind of went bust after immigration laws made it really impossible for them to continue to run their labor businesses, they often turned to things like restaurants and laundries and hotels, right? These kinds of businesses that allowed them to maintain some kind of income. But yeah, there definitely is a kind of class sort of hierarchy within these immigrant communities for sure. And agriculture was not I think the biggest employer of Chinese workers in particular, but it was there, especially in the late 19th century. I think Chinese workers tended to work in agriculture more in California, but they still were sort of present. But yeah, maybe not in the numbers as other regions. Yeah, thank you.
Anyone in the central or in the middle section? Here's one.
Was Tacoma parallel to Seattle in terms of this social structure and marginal? Okay.
Yes. Tacoma, well, so interestingly, Tacoma was kind of a bigger deal than Seattle for a while, in kind of like the 1860s, 1870s, because the Northern Pacific built its terminus in Tacoma. Well, it wasn't necessarily a direct terminus. There was a line, I think it went to Kalama along the Columbia River, and then they had a line up to Tacoma. So in fact, Tacoma was kind of this competitor to Seattle, and the kind of Henry Yeslers and the boosters of the time were really worried about that. And so they kind of tried to, that was sort of like a chip on their shoulder. But one of the things that I think brought Seattle really kind of more dominant position than Tacoma regionally was the connection with Japan. So Seattle became a huge hub of Japanese immigration and also of kind of trans-Pacific trade in the 1890s. It had a direct stop. It was a direct port, like it had a direct steamship line from Yokohama to Seattle that opened, I believe, in 1894. So that in part, right, and also the gold rush were the two things that I think kind of, brought Seattle into a more prominent position than Tacoma. But for sure, Tacoma was kind of its competitor for those first couple decades. But it had a similar demographic, yeah, for sure. When was the gold rush? 1896.
Any questions here? Adele, do you? Any?
Was it 97, 98? Okay, thank you. 1897 to 98.
Okay. Oh,
No.
here's one.
You didn't mention the Filipino immigrants. I'd like to hear a little bit more about them.
Sure. Well, I definitely, in my book, have a whole chapter on Filipino migration. So Seattle, again, we're talking about a Pacific connection. So first China, Japan, the Philippines. The Philippines was a bit different because the Philippines was a colony of the United States. So Filipinos were coming over not as immigrants, but as they were called nationals, U.S. nationals. It was a category that was created after the Spanish-American War to apply to American colonial subjects who are coming to the United States, again, not as immigrants, but not as citizens. So Seattle was a huge hub of Filipino migration starting in the 1920s, and it accelerated in the 1930s. And Filipinos, I think, were among the groups that migrated the most and that migrated within the greatest distances. They traveled because they came during the time of the Great Depression. And so there were very few jobs. And so they were forced to travel, huge distances. So they would stop in Seattle. They would go up to Alaska for the salmon canning season. They would go to either Eastern Washington or sometimes down to the Central Valley in California to pick, crops. And then they would come back to Seattle. And so that was their, huge distances. And they had, they lived in the same area. And they often had pretty tense relationships actually with Japanese immigrants because of what was happening in Asia, I think, that kind of trans-Pacific context of war in the Pacific. But yeah, so that happened, and what we see is that Japanese immigrants actually who ran a lot of farms, like on Bainbridge, on Vashon, different areas of the Northwest, relied a lot on Filipino workers to work on their farms. Yeah, so and there was a lot of mixed relationships and families that developed between Filipino men, again, it was a very male population, and Native women, and also white women. So we have a lot of interracial families in that community, and often we see these relationships formed in the agricultural industry in these labor camps during harvest season. Yeah.
Excuse me. Was there any influence of the Communist Party at various times through the unions or just into the immigrant society?
The Communist Party, I'm not sure. Yeah, yes. But, immigrants, workers in the Northwest, kind of the early 20th century, these kinds of communist and socialist ideas were hotly debated in these circles, right? It was very much, I think, appealing to a lot of folks. And I even found an example of Japanese lumber workers in Mukilteo, which is kind of this, it's near Everett, Washington. It was a lumber town, who had a socialist reading group. And they read all the works of Marx that had been translated into Japanese. So it's really interesting. So there was a kind of, I think, a diversity of sort of political opinions, and ideas were hotly debated and talked about among these workers, obviously the IWW as well. So it was definitely a time when we see socialist, communist ideas widely accepted, and again, kind of debated. And workers were very, by the example of these workers having like a reading group, a Marxist reading group in, the 19 teens, speaks to, I think, how that kind of ideology or that set of politics was really kind of popular, right, in these circles. Yeah, and I know that among Filipinos as well, in the 30s and into the 40s, some became members of the Communist Party. That a bit later, right? But yeah, that happened too.
The reason I'm asking this is because in the white immigrant society, the Communist Party was very much a protection against the capitalist exploiters. And so when the immigrant society, when the next wave of immigrants, this was post-World War, came, there was tremendous strife between the early immigrants who supported the Communist Party and the immigrants who were now the refugees from the communist system.
For sure. So a couple things about that. I would say that we do see in the Northwest, and this is true, also in the West Coast, that actually immigration restriction and like deportations were really targeting people who were outspoken in that way. And so we do see a kind of purging of these influences through immigration enforcement, right? Because 1917, we have new categories of inadmissibility for immigrants, including, right, sort of subversive political views. But I would say that's also true, your second point, about this tension between kind of earlier generations and then later generations in groups. So we see this today with, in the Asian American community, where in the 60s and 70s, some of this was attractive to activists, right? Looking at reading Ho Chi Minh, reading, stuff written by Mao, and then you have newer immigrants who are coming from these places. There's a huge clash there. It's still true today, yeah.
I wanted to ask about the people coming, were they largely men? It seems like this kind of moving from here to there and back again would work well for a single man, but families and women don't seem like they fit in here.
Some of them did. So it depends which group we're talking about. So with Native workers, they often traveled as families. Indigenous workers, we find agriculture in particular was very much a family occupation. But with other groups, it was very male. But I think with Asians, part of it was the way the immigration laws were structured. So there was an act called the Page Act of 1876 that made it almost impossible for Chinese women to immigrate to the United States. So it was almost like they were kind of forced to come as single men. Of course, many of them were married in China, but they would come over by themselves. So it kind of depends on what group we're talking about. But yes, it was an occupation that was heavily male, although there were some women who also worked in agriculture. And Seattle's population, up until, I would say, it starts to change a little bit during World War I, was very disproportionately male because of that, because of the kind of work that was here. It starts to change again in World War II, certainly by World War I, certainly by World War II. We see a much more a kind of evening out of the population because, in part, the economy changes and there's different industries here, like Boeing, right? Shipbuilding, where there's a more stationary, the workforce is more stationary. People are coming, for different reasons. But yeah, it's very male. And part of that kind of sawdust area that I talked about, one of the things that city leaders often commented on was the fact that it was a lot of single men, right? Living together, living in these spaces. Also single women, but mostly single men, and that was kind of disturbing, right? And so we see a lot of policing of places where single men are living, socializing together. You saw the bunkhouse picture, right? So it was kind of this tension, I think, in city government for sure about, what are they doing? And associating single men in particular with kind of labor radicalism, with troublemaking, and so on. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm embarrassed I can't remember the name of the author, but there's a woman who's written a book about the single room occupant hotels. It's in Pioneer Square area.
Marie Wong.
Thank you, thank you. And I heard her presentation at the Seattle Public Library and hoping she can also come here. And it began my thinking about all those single-room occupant hotels. And I actually managed to do visiting nursing even in the 80s in those buildings. And it had not really occurred to me, but you just reinforced so much that they were providing a huge need. Yeah. And Bob Santos, in his stories about his growing up, talks about living with the aunt and uncle to go to school during the week, but spending the weekends with his father in one of those hotels down there, and how all these guys made fusses because he was, oh, little Sammy. Anyway, I mean, there's amazing history down there.
Yes, for sure. So I do have a chapter in my book about single room occupancy hotels and their importance in sustaining this kind of labor force that was sort of itinerant. But I should say that, you know, the International District is where we see, even today, there's still some of those buildings that still stand. Right, like the NP Hotel, the Panama Hotel, if you folks are familiar, that was an SRO. Interestingly, what I realized is that how zoning laws, though, were really applied unequally to different neighborhoods in the city. The International District could not have single-family homes. That was against the zoning code at the time. It was zoned as commercial industrial. So they could not have single-family homes. So that's why there were so many single-room occupancy hotels, because there were people who were forced to live in that neighborhood but did not have single-family homes. And so they were living in, they were called residential hotels. So the hotel became a home. But so that's an example, I think, of how, you know, these zoning laws and other forms of exclusion, these tools of exclusion, were applied to particular neighborhoods. And also, just a kind of coda to this, I don't talk about this in my book, but there's this sort of after story after World War II. A lot of these single room occupancy hotel buildings were demolished during this era of urban renewal, when you have the freeway being built right through. I mean, I-5 was built right through the International District, Chinatown, cut it in half. Dozens and dozens and dozens of single room occupancy hotels were demolished. And with that, really important form of housing, especially for immigrants, for low-income folks, right? Affordable. So it really was a huge blow, I think, to the district and to the city. Yeah.
I had a question about, hello?
Oh, it's here? Sorry. I'm sorry. Okay. Yeah, okay.
Okay. The, excuse me, the Washington State part of the Klondike National Park is down in the International District, and it has it's been a while since I've been there, but it had reference to Japanese-owned hotel buildings. But is there more that National Park Center building could be doing based on your kind of thing?
You know, I haven't been there in a long time. It's been about 15 years, so I'm not sure. I know. So time to visit. I do. My issue with the gold rush is not that, of course, we should know the history of the gold rush. It was important to Seattle, but it's often the only thing people think of when they think of, you know, how Seattle became prominent. And it really privileges a certain type of voice and experience, which is the white male miner. Yeah, who goes up to Alaska and right? So that's kind of my issue with the story of and how prominent the story is in kind of the way we think about Seattle history. But I think in general, it's an interesting, it's definitely important history. But I think, yeah, I mean, but about your question about the Japanese, they owned, I think I found they owned 25%, or not owned, operated, managed 25% of all the hotel space in Seattle in the 1920s. So they were a huge presence in the industry. I think it was, yeah, and they were only, 1% of the population, if not less, of the city at the time. So very disproportionately overrepresented in operating hotels. Again, they didn't own the property. They owned the business inside, but it was a very common occupation for Japanese immigrants. Yeah, back in the day, for sure.
an interesting perspective on this history is what? An interesting perspective on all this is that we've had in the state of Washington a Chinese American governor, Gary Locke,
Oh, yeah.
who served in the legislature in the 1980s and proceeded over time to become executive parts of the local government and then governor.
Yeah, we do have a legacy of Asian Americans in political office in Washington State and in the city. I mean, our mayor, right, is Japanese American, half Japanese. So yes, there is a history, I think, of Asian Americans being prominent in city government and state government. And I think, it speaks to the important role that Asian Americans played historically in the city, right? And that we persisted here. It's like there was exclusion, there was violence against the Chinese, there was incarceration of Japanese Americans, but we returned to the city, and we kind of, we were persistent, right? And our communities kind of are still here. So I think that's an important part of, your point, right? We're still here. Yeah.
During the Depression, we had this Hooverville down in the industrial area, which must have been a major portion of the whole city population. Was the demography there among mostly single men similar to these other currents that you're talking about?
It was very similar. I feel like there were fewer Japanese immigrants in Hooverville, actually. And I'm not an expert in Hooverville, but but it was very much this migratory worker, kind of seasonally employed, seasonally unemployed worker who was devastated by the Depression because they were marginalized to begin with, and then the Depression just, was very devastating. And so the question was about Hooverville, this shantytown that existed in the industrial area. Interestingly, Hooverville was demolished, it was burned to the ground by the city in 1940, the same year that the city also demolished, quote-unquote, Profanity Hill, Yesler Hill. And in the case of Yesler Hill, they built Yesler Terrace. But Hooverville, the land was valuable because it was in the industrial area, and this was World War II. And so Seattle, the city, needed the land. But these two demolitions happened the same time.
Thank you very much. And if you're interested in the book, it's right over there. And $27.53 made out to Elliott Bay Books. That includes tax, obviously. So thank you.